The war did not end at sea with a trumpet or a ceremony, but with silence, rot, and waiting. Ships that had once crowded the harbors with the noise of preparation now lay slack against the docks, their rigging creaking in the wind, their hulls fouled with growth, their crews dismissed with a few coins or nothing at all. The cannons were cold, the flags furled, and the men who had carried empire across oceans stood idle along the waterfronts, watching the tide rise and fall with nowhere left to go. Peace, when it came, arrived not as relief, but as a rupture, severing thousands of sailors from the only system that had ever fed them. In the great port cities of the Atlantic world, at the end of the 17th century, the aftermath of war unfolded as a slow emergency. London, Bristol, Amsterdam, and the colonial harbors of the Caribbean filled with unemployed seamen whose skills were useless on land and whose bodies bore the marks of years at sea. They had survived storms, disease, battle, and hunger under state command, only to be discarded when treaties were signed and budgets tightened. Wages stopped immediately. Promised prize money was delayed, reduced, or lost in legal disputes that favored merchants and officials who never sailed. Contracts dissolved overnight. The same governments that had demanded absolute obedience now offered nothing but indifference. These men did not drift into piracy because they desired chaos, nor because they rejected authority in some abstract sense. They were pushed there by a system that trained them for violence, depended on their labor during war, and then withdrew support while keeping its laws intact. The state had created a vast maritime workforce accustomed to risk, discipline, and plunder, and then dismantled the structure that gave that violence legal form. The sea did not change. The trade routes remained crowded with valuable cargo. Only the permission had vanished. During wartime, the line between sailor, soldier, and criminal had already been thin. Thousands had served aboard privateers, vessels privately owned but authorized by governments through letters of marque to attack enemy shipping. These men learned to board ships at speed, to threaten crews into surrender, to strip cargo, and to navigate the legal gray space where violence was not merely tolerated, but rewarded. They were paid not in wages, but in shares, their survival tied directly to successful capture. The state had not merely allowed this system, it had encouraged it, expanded it, and relied on it to wage war cheaply. When peace arrived, that same violence was abruptly reclassified. The paper authority that had made capture lawful was revoked, but nothing replaced it. The skills remained. The ships remained. The desperation intensified. Sailors who had once been celebrated for weakening enemy commerce were now warned that the same axe would earn them the noose. The transformation was not gradual, and it was not explained. It was simply declared. In the Caribbean, the collapse was especially sharp. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ended more than a decade of nearly continuous war, and with it the legal foundation for privateering. Port cities that had thrived on captured prizes and military spending suddenly faced economic contraction. Taverns stayed open, shipyards went quiet, and men who had expected continued employment found themselves trapped between debt and hunger. Colonial governors received instructions to suppress piracy even as they lacked the resources to employ or feed the men now flooding their harbors. The contradiction was not lost on anyone who lived there. For a sailor discharged in Nassau or Port Royal, the choices were brutally limited. Returning home across the Atlantic required money most did not have. Staying in port meant competing for a handful of merchant berths that paid poorly and often withheld wages. The Navy, when it recruited at all, did so through coercion, offering harsh discipline and uncertain survival. Hunger was immediate and debt relentless. Creditors did not wait for peace to feel prosperous. They waited for repayment. The sea, however, still offered opportunity. Merchant ships continued to sail, carrying sugar, tobacco, silver, and manufactured goods along routes every sailor knew by heart. These ships were lightly defended, now that war had ended, their owners eager to reduce costs. The same states that preached order encouraged commerce to resume quickly, exposing their trade to the very men they had abandoned. This was not oversight, it was calculation. Protection was expensive. Risk was cheaper when borne by someone else. In this vacuum, piracy did not erupt as rebellion, but as continuity. Crews reassembled from men who already trusted one another, often veterans of the same privateers. Ships were seized not through grand battles, but through familiarity, surprise, and shared experience. The tactics were inherited directly from state service. Flags were changed, names were altered. The work itself remained the same. To the men involved, the shift was not ideological, it was logistical. What changed most was legality, not behavior. Acts that had been praised months earlier were now condemned as crimes against humanity and order. Yet the methods, routes, and targets were indistinguishable from those employed under official sanction. This contradiction sat at the heart of the emerging pirate crisis. States demanded obedience while refusing responsibility. They criminalized survival without addressing the conditions that made survival illegal. On the docks, this reality was visible in small human ways. Men slept in abandoned warehouses or on the decks of idle ships. Injuries once treated as the cost of service now meant permanent exclusion from work. Sailors sold their clothes, their tools, and finally their loyalty, not because they rejected authority, but because authority had already rejected them. Rumors traveled faster than official notices. Word spread of ships that had sailed out and returned with coin, of crews who divided plunder evenly, of captains chosen by vote rather than imposed by commission. These stories were not fantasies of freedom. They were reports of sustenance. The state watched this development with a mixture of denial and convenience. As long as piracy remained limited, scattered, and directed against foreign shipping, it could be tolerated, even quietly exploited. Stolen goods entered colonial markets through intermediaries who asked few questions. Governors who lacked funds accepted bribes to look the other way. Merchants purchased cheap cargo and sold it at full price. The system adjusted itself around the illegality it publicly condemned. This tolerance was not accidental. Piracy functioned in these early years as a pressure valve for a maritime economy that had no plan for peace. It absorbed surplus labor, redistributed goods, and maintained circulation in regions where official trade faltered. The state did not design piracy deliberately, but it created every condition necessary for its emergence and then benefited from its existence while denying responsibility. For the sailors themselves, there was little illusion about the danger. Pirate crews died young. Disease, violence, and execution were constant threats. But these were familiar risks, no worse than those faced in naval service and often more predictable. The difference lay not in safety, but in agency. A pirate crew chose its course because no one else would. The sea became not a symbol of freedom, but a last remaining employer. As the first pirate ships slipped out of harbor under cover of night, they carried with them the unresolved contradictions of empire. They were the product of war, trained by the state, abandoned by peace, and sustained by trade networks that refused to collapse. Their existence exposed the fragility of maritime order, revealing how thin the line was between legal violence and criminal survival. This was not the beginning of piracy, as legend would later tell it. It was the continuation of a system that had simply withdrawn its name. The moment the state lost control was not marked by a single act of defiance or a dramatic declaration. It occurred quietly, as men made practical decisions in the face of hunger and neglect. Ships sailed because they could. Crews formed because they had to. The sea, indifferent and unchanged, accepted them as it always had. And in that acceptance lay the next transformation, as ports that had once supplied empires began to nurture something the empires would soon claim to fear. The system that would later be denounced as piracy had already been tested, refined, and legitimized by the very states that claimed to oppose it. Long before black flags appeared on the horizon, maritime violence had been formalized, regulated, and encouraged through a mechanism that allowed governments to wage war without bearing its full cost. The privateer was not an outlaw lurking at the edge of legality, but a sanctioned instrument of state power, carrying official documents that transformed plunder into policy. A letter of marque was a simple piece of paper, but its consequences were immense. Issued by a crown or parliament, it authorized a privately owned vessel to attack the shipping of an enemy state. The holder was permitted to seize cargo, capture ships, and imprison crews, all in the name of national interest. In return, the government avoided the expense of maintaining a large navy, while merchants and ship owners financed the violence themselves in exchange for a share of the profits. It was a system designed to outsource war, and it worked precisely because it blurred the boundary between commerce and combat. For the sailors who served aboard these vessels, the distinction between legal and illegal violence was abstract at best. Their daily reality consisted of long watches, cramped quarters, and the constant calculation of risk against reward. Payment came not as steady wages, but as shares of whatever was taken. Success meant food, drink, and temporary comfort. Failure meant debt, injury, or death. The incentives were clear, and they shaped behavior more effectively than any written law. Privateering taught sailors how to hunt. Crews learned the rhythms of trade routes, the weaknesses of merchant defenses, and the psychology of intimidation. They practiced boarding under fire, securing decks crowded with frightened men, and stripping a vessel of everything valuable before the authorities could intervene. They learned to operate with speed and surprise, to trust one another in moments when hesitation meant disaster. These were not incidental skills. They were the core competencies of a maritime workforce trained explicitly for predation. The legal framework surrounding privateering did not restrain violence as much as it redirected it. Rules existed on paper, governing which flags could be attacked and which ports were off limits, but enforcement was inconsistent and often impossible at sea. Once a ship was taken, the treatment of its crew depended less on law than on circumstance. Some captives were treated carefully, knowing they might later testify in prize courts. Others were abused, abandoned, or quietly killed when they became inconvenient. The state rarely intervened unless its own interests were threatened. Prize courts, established to adjudicate the legality of captures, further entrenched this culture. These courts were slow, distant, and heavily influenced by merchants and officials who benefited from successful seizures. Sailors waited months or years for their shares, often receiving far less than promised once fees, bribes, and deductions were applied. The experience taught a clear lesson. Legality did not guarantee fairness, and authority did not protect the men who did the fighting. During prolonged conflicts, such as the War of the Spanish Succession, privateering expanded rapidly. Thousands of sailors passed through its ranks, many cycling between naval service, merchant shipping, and privateering, depending on opportunity. The distinctions between these roles were porous. A man might sail under a naval commission one year, a privateer the next, and a merchant ship after that. What remained constant was the expectation that violence against shipping was an acceptable means of survival when sanctioned by the right authority. This fluidity mattered because it normalized a particular relationship between sailors and the state. Loyalty was transactional, based on access to work and the promise of reward. When the state paid, it was obeyed. When it delayed, cheated, or withdrew, that loyalty weakened. The privateering system taught sailors that legitimacy was temporary and conditional, something granted and revoked according to political convenience rather than moral principle. The transition from privateer to pirate did not require a psychological break or a rejection of order. It required only the disappearance of the paper that made familiar actions lawful. When peace treaties were signed and letters of marque invalidated, the practices remained intact. Ships still sailed the same waters, crews still recognized the same signals, merchants still carried the same goods. The difference lay solely in how the state chose to describe what was happening. This ambiguity was exploited at every level. Colonial governors often issued vague or outdated commissions, allowing favored captains to continue operating under the pretense of legality. Merchants invested in ventures whose legal status was deliberately unclear, profiting whether the cargo was seized under lawful authority or not. Courts hesitated to prosecute men whose actions resembled those recently celebrated as patriotic service. The system resisted clarity because clarity threatened profit. For sailors, the lesson was reinforced again and again. The state's approval was unreliable, but the skills it had taught them were always valuable. A man who knew how to navigate by dead reckoning, manage a crew under stress, and seize a ship efficiently possessed a form of capital that could not be taken away by treaty. When legal employment vanished, that capital did not disappear. It simply sought a new context. Privateering also shaped expectations aboard ship. Many privateer crews operated under articles that specified shares, compensation for injury, and limits on authority. These agreements were not democratic in any modern sense, but they offered predictability in a world defined by uncertainty. A sailor knew what he stood to gain and what he risked losing. When he was beaten or cheated, he could identify the breach clearly. This mattered deeply when comparing service under state command to life outside it. Naval discipline, by contrast, was often arbitrary and brutal. Impressment forced men into service without consent. Punishments were severe and public, designed to instill fear rather than loyalty. Food was rationed poorly, pay delayed indefinitely, and survival treated as secondary to obedience. Many sailors experienced privateering as harsh but comprehensible, while naval service felt distant, impersonal, and indifferent to their survival. These experiences did not make sailors revolutionaries, but they shaped their calculations. When peace stripped away legal privateering without addressing the underlying conditions, it created a population uniquely prepared to continue maritime violence without authorization. The state had taught them how to do this work, rewarded them for it, and then declared it immoral without changing its methods or its needs. As reports of early pirate activity began to circulate, officials spoke of sudden moral collapse and criminal contagion. Yet nothing about the behavior itself was new. Ships were seized in the same waters, using the same techniques, by men drawn from the same communities. What had changed was the direction of violence. It was no longer aligned perfectly with state interest, and that misalignment transformed familiar practices into threats. The persistence of privateering culture explains why early piracy was often organized, disciplined, and strategic rather than chaotic. Crews knew how to divide labor, enforce rules, and manage risk. Captains emerged from experience rather than bravado. Decisions were shaped by memory of what had worked under official sanction. Piracy did not arise from an absence of order, but from the collapse of a particular legal framework that had once given order its name. By the time states began to speak of piracy as an external menace, they were confronting a distorted reflection of their own policies. The men they hunted had been trained in their wars, fed by their economies, and conditioned to see maritime violence as work. The sea had not changed, nor had the men. Only the state's willingness to acknowledge its role had diminished. This contradiction would soon become impossible to ignore. As pirate crews multiplied and trade suffered, governments would be forced to choose between reforming the system that produced this violence or attempting to erase its consequences through force. That reckoning had not yet arrived, but it was already visible in the uneasy coexistence between legality and survival, between paper authority and lived experience. The privateer had shown what was possible when violence was licensed. The pirate would soon demonstrate what happened when that license was withdrawn without responsibility. Peace did not arrive as a correction to excess, but as an abrupt reversal that exposed how little the state understood the lives it had shaped. Treaties were signed in distant capitals by men who had never slept in a faux CE sleeve or waited for prize money that never came. Ink dried on parchment, cannons fell silent, and proclamations were issued declaring the seas open once more to lawful commerce. For governments, this marked a return to order. For the sailors who lived by the rhythms of war, it marked the beginning of criminality without transition. The Treaty of Utrecht, concluded in 1713, formally ended years of conflict that had drawn thousands of privateers into service across the Atlantic world. Its clauses addressed borders, succession, and trade rights, but said nothing about the men whose labor had enforced those agreements at sea. Letters of marque expired automatically. Privateering commissions were revoked with no provision for compensation or absorption into peacetime fleets. The violence that had been encouraged only months earlier was now declared illegal in all its forms. This transformation was not theoretical. It reached the docks with immediate force. Ships that had sailed legally under national flags were seized by customs officials. Captains were warned that continued operations would lead to prosecution. Crews were dismissed en masse, often without final payment. In port after port, the same pattern repeated: a sudden surplus of experienced sailors, a collapse in maritime employment, and an uncompromising legal shift that offered punishment but no alternatives. The timing was cruelly precise. Merchant shipping, though resuming, could not absorb the numbers released by demobilization. Peacetime trade required fewer hands, moved more cautiously, and paid less. Ship owners took advantage of the labor surplus to drive down wages, impose harsher contracts, and delay payment. Sailors who protested found themselves blacklisted or replaced within days. The power balance shifted instantly, and it shifted against the men who had borne the war. Naval service offered no refuge. Governments reduced fleets to cut costs, decommissioning ships and releasing crews even as they warned of the need to suppress piracy. Recruitment continued, but through impressment rather than incentive. Men were dragged aboard against their will, subjected to rigid discipline, and paid irregularly, if at all. For sailors who had tasted the relative autonomy of privateering, the Navy appeared less a solution than another form of confinement. The legal system offered no relief. Courts that had once processed prize claims efficiently now moved slowly, overwhelmed by disputes over captures made in the final months of war. Sailors waited in port for judgments that might never come, living on credit extended by tavern owners and lodging houses who knew exactly how desperate their customers had become. Debt accumulated quickly. A man who had survived a decade of war could be ruined in a season of peace. The speed with which legality shifted created a category of men who were not rebels by conviction, but criminals by default. A sailor who seized a ship in 1712 might be celebrated, while one who did the same in 1714 faced execution. There was no retraining, no amnesty period, no effort to ease the transition. The state simply declared a new reality and expected compliance from men whose survival had always depended on flexibility rather than obedience. In the Caribbean, this contradiction was sharpened by geography and distance. Colonial governors received instructions to suppress piracy, but lacked the resources to enforce them consistently. Naval patrols were thin, courts were understaffed. At the same time, the economic foundations of many colonies depended on maritime activity that now faltered without privateering income. Sugar plantations struggled to export surplus. Merchants complained of stagnant trade. The official demand for order collided with an unofficial need for circulation. This tension produced selective enforcement. Some captains were arrested and made examples of, while others were ignored or quietly protected. Bribes flowed easily in ports where officials were underpaid and surrounded by unemployed sailors capable of violence. The boundary between legal and illegal activity blurred further as necessity and convenience overrode principle. The state's message was inconsistent, and inconsistency bred opportunity. For sailors, the lesson was unmistakable. Obedience offered no security. Loyalty was not rewarded. Legality shifted according to political needs rather than human realities. In this environment, survival depended on networks rather than institutions. Former crewmates sought one another out. Ships that had once sailed under commission were refitted quietly. Supplies were acquired through informal channels. The infrastructure of maritime violence remained intact, waiting only for a decision. That decision was rarely framed as defiance. It emerged from arithmetic. A sailor calculated his debts, his prospects, and the time he could afford to wait. Merchant work might offer subsistence after months of uncertainty. Naval service promised hardship with no clear end. Piracy offered immediate risk, but immediate reward. It was not chosen because it was lawful or heroic, but because it was available. The first voyages after peace were often cautious. Crews targeted small, poorly defended ships. Captures were swift, violence limited when possible, and crews released quickly to avoid attracting attention. These were not the actions of men seeking notoriety. They were attempts to manage risk in an environment where every option carried danger. Piracy functioned as a continuation of war economy by other means, adapted to the new legal landscape. States responded with rhetoric rather than reform. Proclamations condemned piracy as a moral disease, blaming individual greed and depravity. Little attention was paid to the structural causes that had produced this behavior. No serious effort was made to provide employment, regulate wages, or integrate former privateers into peacetime economies. The narrative of criminality absolved the state of responsibility while justifying repression. This rhetorical shift also served a political purpose. By framing piracy as an external threat rather than an internal failure, governments protected their legitimacy. The pirate became a convenient symbol of disorder, allowing officials to rally support for expanded naval patrols and harsher laws without addressing the conditions that made those measures necessary. Violence was condemned only after it escaped control. For the men at sea, this hypocrisy was not abstract. They experienced it as betrayal. They had risked their lives under state authority, followed orders, and accepted discipline in exchange for legitimacy. When that legitimacy vanished without explanation or compensation, the moral contract was broken. Piracy filled the space left behind, not as ideology, but as practice. The rapid criminalization of familiar behavior also created a sense of inevitability. Once a sailor crossed the line, however reluctantly, return became difficult. Ports closed to known pirates. Amnesties were rare and unreliable. The law offered little distinction between a man who seized one ship out of desperation and one who made piracy his profession. The system encouraged escalation by making retreat costly. As pirate activity increased, states interpreted this growth as proof of inherent criminality rather than predictable consequence. Each new capture was cited as justification for harsher measures, further narrowing legal options for maritime labor. The cycle reinforced itself. Neglect produced piracy. Piracy justified repression. Repression deepened desperation. This was the moment when piracy ceased to be merely an extension of privateering and became a category unto itself. Not because the behavior changed dramatically, but because the state's relationship to maritime labor hardened. The possibility of reintegration diminished. The sea, once a shared space of commerce and conflict regulated by shifting permissions, began to fracture into zones of legality enforced unevenly and often violently. Yet even as governments prepared to suppress piracy, they continued to rely on the same trade networks and maritime expertise that piracy exploited. Merchant ships sailed with minimal protection. Colonial economies remained dependent on seaborne exchange. The contradiction persisted, unresolved, and growing more dangerous with each passing year. The creation of criminals through peace revealed a fundamental flaw in the maritime order of empire. States could mobilize men efficiently for war, but they could not demobilize them responsibly. They could authorize violence, but they could not withdraw that authorization without consequence. The men who became pirates did not emerge from chaos. They emerged from policy. As the early pirate crews gained confidence in numbers, the limits of tolerance approached rapidly. What had been manageable at the margins began to threaten core trade routes. Insurance rates rose. Merchants demanded protection. The same states that had created the conditions for piracy now faced pressure to eradicate it. The stage was set for a new phase, not of neglect, but of confrontation, as governments prepared to turn the full weight of naval power against the very men their systems had produced. Piracy did not grow in isolation on the open sea, nor did it originate in distant coves beyond the reach of authority. It took shape in ports that were officially loyal, legally administered, and deeply enmeshed in imperial systems. These harbors were not lawless frontiers, but managed spaces where commerce, governance, and survival collided. In the years after peace, they became incubators, places where piracy was not only tolerated, but quietly sustained by necessity and profit. Nassau, on the island of New Providence, exemplified this transformation. Once a modest colonial outpost, it was battered repeatedly by war and neglect until its defenses collapsed and its administration weakened. By the early 18th century, it sat astride vital shipping lanes, yet lacked the resources to police them. The harbor remained accessible, the anchorage safe, and the local population dependent on maritime trade for survival. Into this vacuum flowed unemployed sailors, damaged ships, and captains willing to exploit the ambiguity of authority. The town itself reflected the strain. Houses stood half-repaired, streets eroded by storms and neglect, and supplies arrived irregularly. Official salaries were unpaid or delayed, leaving governors, clerks, and soldiers reliant on informal arrangements to sustain themselves. In such an environment, enforcement of imperial law became selective. A blind eye could be purchased more easily than compliance could be imposed. Piracy did not overthrow order here, it merged with its failures. Port Royal, once the wealthiest and most notorious harbor in the Caribbean, offered a similar lesson. Though its fortunes had declined after the earthquake of 1692, its culture of maritime opportunism endured. Merchants, tavern owners, and ship chandlers understood that pirate crews spent freely and asked few questions. Stolen goods moved through warehouses with altered manifests. Coin changed hands without inquiry into its origin. The boundary between legitimate commerce and illicit trade eroded under the pressure of survival. These ports functioned as logistical nodes rather than ideological centers. They provided water, food, repairs, and markets. They connected pirate crews to blacksmiths, carpenters, and suppliers whose livelihoods depended on steady maritime traffic regardless of its legality. Every repaired mast, every barrel of powder, and every cask of rum represented a choice made by individuals navigating economic collapse rather than embracing criminal identity. The system was sustained not by loyalty to pirates, but by the absence of viable alternatives. Colonial officials occupied an impossible position. Charged with enforcing imperial law, they lacked ships, men, and money. Naval patrols were sporadic and often focused elsewhere. Governors who attempted strict enforcement risked economic paralysis as trade slowed and port activity dried up. Those who tolerated piracy could maintain circulation, feed their populations, and preserve a fragile stability. Many chose the latter, rationalizing their decisions as temporary compromises in extraordinary circumstances. This tolerance created predictable patterns. Pirate ships entered port openly, sometimes flying false flags, sometimes not bothering to conceal their identity. Crews dispersed into taverns and lodging houses, blending with sailors from merchant and naval vessels. Captains negotiated sales through intermediaries who understood how to disguise origin. Goods were broken down, repackaged, and redistributed into legitimate trade flows. By the time authorities in Europe heard of a capture, its profits had already dissolved into the local economy. The human dimension of this arrangement was visible everywhere. Dock workers unloaded cargo without asking questions because employment was scarce. Craftsmen repaired hulls because refusing work meant hunger. Tavern keepers extended credit because pirate money was often the only money available. These were not acts of rebellion, but of accommodation. Port communities adapted to piracy because piracy adapted to them. Pirate crews themselves were shaped by these environments. Ports offered places to recruit replacements, repair internal disputes, and plan future voyages. Information flowed freely in taverns, where sailors exchanged news of ship movements, defenses, and political changes. Intelligence was not gathered through espionage, but through conversation, memory, and shared experience. The port became an extension of the ship, a place where maritime knowledge accumulated and circulated. This intimacy between port and pirate blurred distinctions further. Many men moved fluidly between roles, sailing one season as a pirate, the next as a merchant sailor, depending on opportunity and risk. Records rarely captured these transitions, contributing later to the illusion of a separate pirate class. In reality, piracy was often a phase rather than a permanent identity, shaped by the shifting availability of legal work. States were aware of this permeability and exploited it when convenient. Officials who tolerated pirates could also turn against them suddenly, seizing ships or arresting captains to demonstrate loyalty to imperial directives. These gestures of enforcement were often symbolic, targeting a few individuals while leaving the broader system intact. The unpredictability reinforced the sense that legality was arbitrary, further eroding respect for authority. The concentration of pirate activity in certain ports also reflected strategic logic. Safe harbors near major trade routes minimized time at sea and maximized opportunity. Proximity to markets reduced the need for long voyages to dispose of cargo. Ports that offered both access and anonymity became magnets, drawing more crews and amplifying their importance. As activity increased, so did the economic dependence of the port on piracy, deepening the cycle. Nassau's transformation into a de facto pirate haven by the second decade of the 18th century was not the result of an uprising, but of accumulation. Each tolerated arrival normalized the next. Each successful sail reinforced the practice. Over time, the port's identity shifted, not because its inhabitants embraced piracy as an ideal, but because imperial neglect left them little choice. Order was not overthrown, it was repurposed. This repurposing alarmed metropolitan authorities, who began to receive reports of ports effectively operating outside control. Merchants complained of rising losses, insurance rates increased, diplomatic tensions grew as foreign shipping suffered. The informal compromises that sustained colonial stability now threatened imperial revenue and international relations. What had been manageable at the periphery was becoming visible at the center. The port incubators of piracy thus forced a reckoning. They demonstrated that piracy was not a fringe phenomenon, but a systemic response to economic and administrative failure. Suppressing it would require more than proclamations and executions. It would demand resources, reform, and sustained presence, none of which came easily or cheaply. As pirate activity expanded outward from these harbors, states faced a choice they had long avoided. They could continue to tolerate piracy's benefits while condemning its excesses, or they could commit to dismantling the conditions that allowed it to thrive. The next phase would reveal which path they chose, as the relationship between pirates and the economies that sustained them grew too visible and too costly to ignore. Piracy endured not because it disrupted imperial economies, but because for a long time it served them. Beneath proclamations and gallows, merchant empires absorbed pirate activity, adjusted to it, and in crucial ways depended upon it. The relationship was not openly acknowledged, but it was widely understood by those who lived and worked along the arteries of maritime trade. Piracy was not an external infection attacking commerce from outside. It functioned as an unofficial regulator within a system already strained by distance, scarcity, and contradiction. European empires of the early 18th century were built on fragile supply chains. Colonial markets were isolated by months of travel, unpredictable weather, and limited naval protection. Demand for manufactured goods outpaced official supply, while colonial produce piled up waiting for ships that might never arrive. Merchants, planters, and officials all operated within this instability, forced to improvise constantly to keep trade moving. In this environment, piracy did not simply steal wealth, it redistributed it. Captured cargoes did not vanish into mythic pirate hordes. They re-entered the economy almost immediately. Sugar, cocoa, textiles, metal goods, and wine moved from seized ships into colonial warehouses, shops, and plantations. Prices dropped, shortages eased. Merchants who publicly condemned piracy privately benefited from its effects, purchasing goods through intermediaries at reduced cost and selling them at full market value. The moral outrage expressed in correspondence rarely matched the calculations made at the counting table. This dynamic was especially visible in colonies where official trade was tightly regulated by mercantilist law. Restrictions on who could trade, what could be shipped, and where goods could be sold created artificial scarcity that piracy conveniently alleviated. A pirate cargo ignored tariffs, monopolies, and navigation acts. It moved according to demand rather than decree. Colonial consumers rarely asked how goods arrived when shelves were full and prices fell. Merchants understood this perfectly. Many insured their ships against piracy while simultaneously investing in ventures that depended on pirate redistribution. Losses could be claimed, profits could be captured elsewhere. The risk was spread, absorbed, and normalized. Piracy became another variable in commercial planning, no different in principle from storms or spoilage. As long as it remained within tolerable limits, it was manageable. Even metropolitan markets felt the effects. Stolen colonial goods filtered back into Europe through secondary ports, smuggled cargoes, and re-exported shipments with altered paperwork. These goods undercut competitors and stimulated consumption. Governments denounced piracy while benefiting from the increased circulation of commodities that piracy enabled. The contradiction was rarely confronted because it worked. Pirates themselves were acutely aware of this dependence. They targeted ships whose cargoes were easily sold and avoided those whose goods lacked markets. Violence was calibrated to minimize damage to valuable commodities. Crews were often released quickly to carry news, spreading fear that encouraged merchants to negotiate rather than resist. Piracy functioned not only as theft, but as pressure. influencing behavior across trade networks. This pressure exposed the limits of imperial protection. Navies could not patrol every route. Convoys slowed commerce and increased costs. Merchants frequently chose speed over safety, gambling that piracy would remain sporadic. When losses occurred, they were framed as unfortunate exceptions rather than structural failures. Piracy was tolerated because eliminating it entirely would have required investments states were unwilling to make. Colonial officials played a delicate role in this balance. They reported piracy to superiors while negotiating quietly with local merchants who depended on pirate goods. Enforcement ebbed and flowed according to political attention rather than consistent policy. A port might crack down briefly to satisfy imperial demands, then relax again once scrutiny faded. This inconsistency allowed piracy to persist as a semi-integrated component of the trading system. The lived experience of this arrangement was deeply uneven. Planters benefited from cheaper supplies. Merchants profited from flexible sourcing. Consumers enjoyed lower prices. Sailors, however, bore the risk. Pirate crews faced constant danger, and merchant sailors suffered capture, confinement, or abandonment. The system externalized its violence downward, concentrating risk among those with the least power while distributing benefits upward through layers of commerce. This imbalance reinforced piracy's appeal among sailors. They could see clearly that merchants and officials profited from the same acts for which pirates were condemned. The moral distinction collapsed under scrutiny. If violence and theft were acceptable when performed through insurance claims and intermediaries, they seemed less reprehensible when undertaken directly. Piracy became, in this sense, a mirror held up to imperial trade, reflecting its underlying logic without its pretense. States tolerated this arrangement until it began to threaten core interests. When pirate activity concentrated along major trade arteries, raising insurance rates, and disrupting large-scale shipments, tolerance gave way to alarm. The issue was not morality, but scale. Piracy was acceptable when it lubricated the margins of trade, but intolerable when it challenged central flows of revenue and control. The shift in attitude was sudden and forceful. Practices that had been ignored or quietly enabled were recast as existential threats. Pirates were no longer inconvenient partners in redistribution, but enemies of order. The same merchants who had benefited from pirate goods now demanded protection. The same officials who had accepted bribes now called for naval intervention. The system turned against the men who had operated within its gaps. This reversal exposed the fragility of the relationship. Pirates had thrived because they filled structural voids, but they were never indispensable. Once states committed resources to suppress them, their informal role in the economy became a liability rather than an asset. The transition from tolerance to eradication was not gradual. It was decisive and unforgiving. Yet even as repression intensified, the underlying dynamics remained unchanged. Trade still depended on long, vulnerable routes. Labor conditions at sea remained harsh. Economic incentives continued to reward risk-taking. Piracy declined not because its causes were addressed, but because its costs were forcibly raised beyond what individuals could bear. The period when merchant empires quietly needed pirates reveals a truth often obscured by later mythology. Piracy did not flourish in opposition to global trade. It flourished within it, sustained by the same forces that drove ships across oceans and commodities into markets. The boundary between lawful commerce and criminal predation was not fixed by principle, but negotiated through convenience. As states prepared to crush piracy through spectacle and force, they did so without acknowledging how deeply it had been woven into their own systems. The pirate would soon be isolated, hunted, and erased from economic utility. But the conditions that had produced him would persist, shifting risk once again onto sailors whose lives remained expendable. The reckoning that followed would be brutal, public, and deliberate, as empires moved to sever a relationship they had never fully admitted existed. The choice between piracy and lawful service was not made in abstraction, nor was it driven by romance or ideology. It was made aboard ships, under conditions that shaped bodies and expectations day by day. For sailors who weighed their options in the years after peace, the comparison that mattered most was not between legality and crime, but between systems of discipline. What kind of authority would govern their lives, and how predictable that authority would be, often mattered more than what flag flew overhead. Life aboard a naval vessel was defined by hierarchy, enforced through fear. The captain embodied near absolute authority, delegated downward through officers whose power was maintained by punishment rather than consent. Orders were expected to be obeyed instantly, without explanation or appeal. Discipline was public, ritualized, and intentionally humiliating. Flogging, confinement, and reduction of rations were applied not only to correct behavior, but to remind the crew of their position within an unyielding structure. The purpose was not fairness, but control. Naval punishment was also deeply impersonal. A sailor might be beaten for an infraction he barely understood, punished under regulations written far from the sea and applied without regard to circumstance. Illness did not excuse failure. Injury did not guarantee mercy. Death was treated as an administrative loss rather than a human one. The system functioned on the assumption that sailors were replaceable, an assumption reinforced by impressment, which filled ships with men taken by force rather than choice. Food and pay under naval service reflected this indifference. Rations were calculated to sustain life at minimum cost, often spoiled by long storage and poor handling. Scurvy, dysentery, and fever spread through crews already weakened by hunger. Pay was delayed routinely, sometimes for years, withheld through bureaucratic obstruction that sailors could neither influence nor contest. A man might survive a campaign only to find himself discharged with nothing, his labor absorbed into a system that acknowledged him only when discipline failed. Merchant service offered little improvement. Wages were low, contracts vague, and enforcement arbitrary. Captains exercised broad authority with minimal oversight. Sailors were bound by debt and desertion laws that punished them harshly for attempting to escape intolerable conditions. Abuse was common and rarely punished. The law protected property and profit, not the bodies that moved cargo across oceans. Against this backdrop, pirate ships appeared not as utopias, but as alternative labor systems shaped by shared risk. Authority existed, but it was structured differently. Captains were chosen for competence rather than birth or commission, and their power, though real, was conditional. Decisions about navigation, engagement, and distribution were often governed by written articles agreed upon by the crew. These articles did not eliminate violence or inequality, but they made expectations explicit. Predictability mattered. A sailor aboard a pirate vessel knew how plunder would be divided, what compensation might be offered for injury, and what behaviors would bring punishment. This clarity contrasted sharply with naval service, where discipline was absolute, but outcomes uncertain. On a pirate ship, a beating followed a known violation. In the Navy, punishment could be arbitrary, its severity dependent on an officer's mood rather than a shared code. Pirate discipline was also collective in nature. Crews enforced their own rules because survival depended on cooperation. A man who endangered the ship through negligence threatened everyone aboard. Punishment, when it came, was administered not solely to assert authority, but to preserve order within a small, interdependent community. This did not make it humane, but it made it intelligible. The distribution of food and labor reflected similar pragmatism. Pirate crews understood that starvation weakened fighting capacity. Rations were guarded carefully, and while scarcity remained common, it was managed with an awareness of collective consequence. Work was divided according to ability rather than rank, with experienced sailors valued for their skills rather than their obedience. Injured men were not automatically discarded because every hand mattered. This structure altered how sailors experienced authority. Fear did not disappear, but it was balanced by a sense of participation. A sailor could see how decisions were made, how risks were assessed, and how rewards were allocated. He might still die violently, but he was less likely to be beaten unpredictably or cheated systematically. In a world where certainty was rare, this mattered profoundly. The contrast did not go unnoticed by states. Officials understood that harsh naval discipline drove men away, but they feared reform more than desertion. Discipline was seen as essential to maintaining order over large crews drawn from diverse backgrounds. Any concession to sailor autonomy was viewed as a threat to hierarchy. The result was a system that preserved authority at the cost of loyalty. Piracy exploited this failure. It offered not freedom, but leverage. A sailor who joined a pirate crew gained temporary control over his labor and its rewards. He accepted greater risk in exchange for clearer terms. This was not rebellion against discipline itself, but against its arbitrariness. Pirate ships did not reject order. They reorganized it to suit conditions the state refused to acknowledge. The state responded by portraying pirate discipline as chaos, emphasizing moments of cruelty and excess while ignoring the everyday violence of lawful service. Executions and mutilations aboard pirate ships were cited as proof of inherent savagery, even as naval flogging left men crippled or dead under official sanction. The distinction was not violence versus peace, but authorized versus unauthorized violence. This rhetorical strategy obscured the central issue. Sailors did not flee lawful service because they desired lawlessness. They fled because lawful systems offered no protection against exploitation. Pirate discipline, however brutal, was perceived as reciprocal. Authority existed because it functioned, not because it was imposed by distant power. The effectiveness of pirate crews in battle further reinforced this perception. Ships whose crews trusted their leadership and understood their incentives fought with cohesion. Fear of punishment mattered less than confidence in shared gain. This efficiency alarmed naval commanders who recognized in pirate organization a challenge to the assumption that obedience required terror. The response was not imitation, but suppression. Over time, as states committed more resources to anti-piracy campaigns, this comparison became politically dangerous. If sailors believed pirate ships offered better conditions, recruitment and retention suffered. Governments responded by intensifying discipline rather than reforming it, reinforcing the very dynamics that drove men away. The cycle continued. The comparison between pirate ships and naval vessels reveals why piracy could sustain itself despite overwhelming opposition. It was not simply a refuge for criminals, but an alternative shaped by the failures of legitimate authority. Pirate discipline exposed what sailors endured elsewhere by showing that different arrangements were possible, even under extreme conditions. This did not make piracy sustainable in the long term. Its reliance on violence, plunder, and unstable alliances ensured eventual collapse. But for a time, it functioned as a critique enacted through practice rather than words. It demonstrated that maritime labor could be organized differently, and that men accustomed to risk would choose clarity over coercion when offered no better option. As states moved toward open confrontation, they focused on eliminating pirate ships rather than addressing the conditions that made them attractive. The discipline of the Navy remained unchanged. Merchant service continued to exploit desperation. Piracy would be crushed, but the grievances that fed it would persist, reshaped into new forms of resistance and flight. The next phase would reveal the limits of this suppression. As violence escalated on both sides, the state would confront not just outlaw crews, but the consequences of its own refusal to reform. The comparison between pirate discipline and lawful authority, once whispered among sailors, would become a quiet force shaping every encounter at sea. The violence that defined piracy did not originate outside the structures of empire. It was learned within them, practiced daily, and refined under official sanction long before it was condemned. What distinguished pirates from the states that pursued them was not cruelty or force, but visibility. The state's violence was procedural, distributed through regulation and routine, and therefore easier to ignore. Pirate violence, concentrated in public, exposed methods that governments preferred to keep obscured. Naval service normalized brutality through repetition. Flogging was not an extraordinary measure, but a standard tool, administered in carefully counted strokes before assembled crews. The purpose was not correction alone, but demonstration, a reminder that the body of the sailor belonged to the service. Men collapsed under the lash, skin torn open, infection setting in days later. Deaths occurred, recorded briefly, if at all, their causes attributed to weakness rather than punishment. This violence was lawful, and because it was lawful, it rarely provoked outrage. Abandonment was another sanctioned cruelty. Ships damaged beyond immediate repair were stripped of useful materials and left behind. Crews were sometimes transferred partially, leaving the sick or injured with insufficient supplies, their survival a matter of chance. In times of scarcity, captains prioritized the ship and its mission over individual lives. These decisions were framed as necessity, absorbed into the language of duty and discipline. The men who suffered them were rendered invisible by distance and bureaucracy. Merchant service mirrored these practices with fewer restraints. Captains wielded authority with minimal oversight, enforcing obedience through beating, confinement, and starvation. Sailors who protested risked charges of mutiny, punishable by death. Contracts offered little protection, and courts favored owners over labor. Violence aboard merchant ships was not exceptional. It was an accepted method of maintaining order on voyages where profit depended on speed and compliance. Insurance systems further distanced responsibility. When ships were lost, claims were processed, values assessed, and payments made. Human losses were recorded only insofar as they affected compensation. A drowned sailor was an unfortunate detail, his absence accounted for in ledgers rather than mourned. This abstraction allowed violence to persist without confronting its consequences. The system functioned because suffering was dispersed and anonymized. Pirates inherited these practices, not as innovations, but as continuations. They beat, threatened, and sometimes killed because these methods were familiar and effective. What differed was context. Pirate violence occurred outside legal cover, making it shocking to audiences accustomed to the state's sanitized narratives. The acts themselves were rarely more severe than those sailors had already experienced under lawful authority. This familiarity shaped pirate behavior in complex ways. Crews often limited violence strategically, recognizing that excessive brutality provoked resistance and pursuit. Captains who tortured indiscriminately risked mutiny or desertion. Violence was a tool, not an expression of chaos. It was calibrated, informed by experience, and constrained by the same practical considerations that governed naval and merchant conduct. The state, however, presented pirate violence as uniquely depraved. Pamphlets and proclamations emphasized sensational acts, detached from context, to construct an image of piracy as moral aberration. This narrative served a purpose. By isolating pirate cruelty, the state could condemn violence without examining its own practices. The contrast reassured the public that order, however harsh, remained preferable to lawlessness. Executions reinforced this distinction through spectacle. Pirates were hanged publicly, their bodies displayed as warnings. The rituals were elaborate, designed to assert authority and restore moral clarity. Crowds gathered to watch men die for acts similar to those celebrated during war. The message was unmistakable. Violence was acceptable only when monopolized by the state. For sailors, this hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. They had endured beatings, starvation, and abandonment under lawful service, only to see similar acts condemned when performed without authorization. The moral language rang hollow. Violence was not judged by its impact on human bodies, but by its alignment with power. This dissonance influenced how pirate crews justified themselves, if only implicitly. They did not claim innocence, but they rejected the idea that their actions were uniquely criminal. Many had been shaped by institutions that treated violence as routine. Piracy did not corrupt them. It revealed what they had already been taught. The sea had never been gentle. It had simply been regulated. States responded by escalating force rather than introspection. Naval patrols intensified. Punishments grew harsher. Legal definitions expanded to encompass broader categories of maritime crime. The goal was deterrence through fear, replicating on a larger scale the discipline already imposed aboard ships. The assumption remained that obedience could be enforced through terror alone. This approach overlooked a critical reality. Violence without legitimacy breeds resistance. Sailors accustomed to brutality were not easily intimidated. Many had already faced death repeatedly. The threat of execution lost its power when life itself offered little security. Suppression campaigns achieved results through overwhelming force, but they did not erase the underlying mistrust between maritime labor and authority. The state's refusal to acknowledge its own role in shaping pirate violence also distorted historical memory. Later accounts emphasized pirate savagery while sanitizing naval discipline. The daily suffering of lawful service faded from view, replaced by narratives of heroic suppression. This selective memory preserved the legitimacy of empire at the expense of truth. Understanding this dynamic clarifies why piracy provoked such anxiety. Pirates embodied a mirror image of state power stripped of its justifications. They exercised violence openly, without the rituals and language that rendered it acceptable. In doing so, they threatened not only trade, but the moral framework that supported imperial authority. As suppression intensified, this threat would be addressed not by reforming maritime labor, but by eliminating its most visible contradiction. Pirates would be hunted, tried, and erased, their stories simplified into cautionary tales. The violence that had produced them would remain embedded in lawful institutions, unchanged and unexamined. The coming campaigns against piracy would therefore be both military and symbolic. They would seek not only to destroy ships and crews, but to reassert the state's monopoly on violence at sea. The outcome would shape maritime order for generations, even as the conditions that had made piracy possible continued to cast long shadows over the lives of those who work the oceans. The turning point arrived not quietly, nor in distant seas, but along the trade routes that connected empire to colony, sugar plantations to European markets, and silver mines to merchant houses. By the second decade of the 18th century, pirate activity was no longer a marginal nuisance confined to isolated coves. It began to disrupt the lifeblood of commerce itself, attacking ships that carried wealth central to imperial economies and forcing governments to confront the consequences of their earlier neglect. What had once been tolerated out of convenience now became intolerable through scale. Insurance rates soared as reports of captured vessels multiplied. Merchants in London, Amsterdam, and Bristol complained that pirate attacks delayed shipments, reduced profits, and undermined confidence in maritime trade. Colonial governors received letters urging immediate action, warning that continued losses threatened the stability of local economies. The very governments that had once turned a blind eye now demanded suppression, their language shifting from tolerance to alarm, from pragmatism to moral outrage. The targets of piracy also changed. Early raids had focused on lightly defended merchantmen carrying goods that could be quickly sold in local markets. These acts, though illegal, did not threaten the overall flow of commerce. As pirate crews grew in experience and confidence, they began to attack larger ships, convoys, and vessels carrying higher value cargo. The stakes rose. Losses were no longer isolated incidents, but events with measurable economic consequences. States could no longer rely on selective enforcement or informal toleration. Navies responded by deploying warships along known pirate routes, attempting to protect convoys and reclaim authority at sea. Campaigns were organized to intercept pirate fleets, sometimes successfully, sometimes with failure. Sailors familiar with naval tactics could anticipate these measures, striking quickly and retreating to hidden coves or friendly ports. This cat-and-mouse game elevated the level of danger, making survival uncertain and emphasizing the skill and organization of pirate crews. Public perception shifted accordingly. Newspapers, pamphlets, and official reports painted pirates as monsters, emphasizing violence, cruelty, and audacity. Executions were celebrated in print, a theater of deterrence designed to reassure metropolitan audiences that order was being restored. Governors issued proclamations warning of death to those who took up the pirate trade, emphasizing morality rather than policy. Yet these public displays often obscured the economic interdependence that persisted quietly. Merchants continued to purchase goods from intermediaries, colonial economies continued to rely on maritime flow, and pirate crews continued to find ports willing to harbor them, if at a price. The human consequences were profound. Sailors who had once considered piracy as a temporary expedient now faced intensified threat. Naval patrols were more vigilant, convoys were better armed, and punishments more severe. Crews could be trapped at sea, captured, and executed. This escalation transformed piracy from a marginal survival strategy into a high-stakes gamble. Each voyage carried the dual potential for wealth or death, and men calculated their risks with care honed by years of experience under both lawful and extra-legal authority. Colonial administrators faced impossible choices. Strict enforcement could destabilize ports, undermine trade, and provoke local unrest. Lax enforcement risked imperial condemnation, diplomatic friction, and economic losses. Some governors attempted compromise, arresting a few notorious captains while quietly allowing others to operate under the table. Bribes and informal arrangements persisted, even as official rhetoric hardened. The ports that had incubated piracy now became arenas of negotiation, coercion, and selective justice. The escalation also revealed the limits of punishment as deterrence. Execution, hanging, and gibbeting served as spectacles, but they did little to address the structural causes that had produced piracy in the first place: surplus of trained sailors, lack of employment, and the enduring skills and knowledge that war had imparted. Young men continued to join pirate crews, lured by the possibility of rapid gain, the promise of autonomy, and the necessity of survival. The cycle of violence and enforcement intensified rather than ended. Merchants and states alike began to recognize the duality of piracy. On one hand, it threatened trade and demanded suppression. On the other, it redistributed wealth, maintained market flow, and offered alternative labor arrangements when official channels failed. The contradiction was rarely acknowledged publicly, but it shaped decisions behind the scenes. Selective tolerance, strategic enforcement, and unofficial collusion all reflected the uncomfortable truth: piracy was both problem and solution within the imperial maritime system. This stage set the conditions for open confrontation. Naval operations became more coordinated, pirate havens were targeted, and governors acted with increasing urgency. Yet the relationship between pirates and the economies that sustained them remained complex. The very skills, knowledge, and networks that made pirates dangerous also made them resilient. Battles were fought not only with cannon and cutlass, but through intelligence, negotiation, and the calculated use of fear. As governments pursued eradication with growing force, they revealed the depth of their earlier neglect. Pirates had become inconvenient because their success exposed the fragility of imperial control. The very states that had fostered maritime violence through privateering, abandoned sailors after peace, and tolerated illicit commerce were now compelled to assert absolute authority. The transition from tolerated nuisance to hunted menace marked a decisive turning point in the history of the sea, the moment when survival, opportunity, and state neglect collided to produce crisis at every level of human experience along the trade routes. The next stage would show the spectacle that accompanied this confrontation, the public display of power, and the moral theater that framed piracy as an external evil, masking the deep entanglement of empire, commerce, and survival that had created it. The campaign to eradicate piracy unfolded not only across the waters of the Caribbean and Atlantic, but in the very harbors that had sustained it. Nassau, Port Royal, and smaller ports like New Providence became focal points for imperial power, where governors, naval officers, and magistrates sought to reassert authority through both demonstration and coercion. The goal was not merely to capture pirates, but to dismantle the systems that enabled them, and to make visible, through spectacle, the state's monopoly on violence at sea. Naval fleets arrived in waves, their masts lined with cannon, crews drilled in precise formations, and officers tasked with coordination across vast distances. These fleets were not sent lightly. They represented months of preparation, logistical planning, and political negotiation. Warships patrolled trade routes, convoyed merchant vessels, and blocked known pirate havens. Every maneuver was calculated to intimidate, isolate, and ultimately destroy pirate resistance. For the sailors aboard these ships, the work was familiar, yet heightened in urgency. Boarding, seizure, and engagement carried consequences that could range from glory to death in moments. Pirate crews responded with the skill and cunning that had allowed them to thrive. Ships slipped through blockades under cover of darkness, using knowledge of currents, shoals, and wind patterns to evade capture. Scouts gathered intelligence in port towns where bribery, loyalty, and fear intermingled. Engagements were fought selectively, with crews weighing risk against potential gain, knowing that one miscalculation could result in capture or annihilation. Survival demanded not only skill, but constant calculation, an intimate awareness of both sea and state. The confrontation was amplified by public spectacle. Captured pirates were transported to colonial courts, tried in open air, and executed with the full gaze of the community. Hanging at the yardarm, gibbeting along the shore, and public beheadings communicated authority in the starkest terms. Spectators, sailors, merchants, officials, and local populations witnessed punishment as moral theater. These acts were not solely about justice. They were designed to frame piracy as a profound moral and legal transgression, a threat removed from pragmatic considerations of labor, survival, and commerce. Yet these displays masked the underlying continuities between lawful and unlawful violence. Sailors on naval vessels, charged with enforcing imperial authority, were often engaged in actions indistinguishable from those they condemned. Boarding parties, seizure of cargo, and the use of threat or actual violence against crews all mirrored techniques developed under privateering. The difference lay in legitimacy rather than method, one sanctioned by commission, the other criminalized by timing and circumstance. The spectacle reframed similar actions into categories of heroism and villainy. Pirate trials reinforced the illusion of moral clarity. Judges recited statutes, juries weighed testimony, and executions followed quickly, often within days. The legal process emphasized the law's authority, not the structural failures that had produced the accused. Yet the histories recorded for metropolitan audiences omitted the underlying causes: abandoned sailors, collapsed economies, and the prior legalization of maritime predation. The narrative presented was simple: pirates were criminals, the state was just, and order was restored through decisive punishment. The psychological impact on sailors and potential recruits was profound. Witnessing the fate of captured pirates underscored the risks of deviation from authority, reinforcing obedience while simultaneously highlighting the precariousness of survival. Yet even these spectacles could not erase the knowledge that naval authority remained selective, bureaucratic, and often indifferent to individual well-being. The tension between fear and necessity persisted, shaping choices and behavior for generations. Economically, the suppression campaigns had complex consequences. The removal of pirate crews disrupted informal redistribution networks, reducing the flow of previously tolerated goods. Ports that had relied on pirate commerce faced contraction. Some merchants experienced short-term losses, even as imperial control increased. The elimination of piracy did not resolve the underlying fragility of maritime labor. It shifted risk onto sailors operating within legal structures that remained harsh and exploitative. For pirates who survived encounters with naval forces, exile, or escape, the calculus became sharper. Every voyage demanded careful assessment of opportunity and danger. Every harbor visit required negotiation and discretion. Experience gained through years of privateering and informal tolerance provided advantage, but no skill could eliminate the growing reach of imperial enforcement. The sea remained a domain of both possibility and peril, where knowledge and courage contended with increasingly concentrated power. The suppression campaigns also revealed the global dimension of piracy's reach. Pirate attacks were no longer confined to the Caribbean. They appeared along the American coast, in West African waters, and near major European trade ports. Imperial authorities were forced to coordinate across oceans, developing strategies for intelligence gathering, rapid response, and legal prosecution. The logistical challenges of global suppression emphasized the dependence of empire on networks of communication, supply, and enforcement, even as those networks had once tolerated piracy for convenience. Through all of this, the human experience remained at the center. Sailors on both sides endured fear, hunger, exhaustion, and the constant awareness of mortality. Captains made life and death decisions with imperfect knowledge. Crews confronted the consequences of both choice and circumstance, navigating survival amid systemic neglect and deliberate coercion. The clash between pirate and state was not abstract. It was measured in bodies, in skill, and in the fragile calculation of risk that marked every moment at sea. By the end of this period, it was clear that the state's assertion of authority was both necessary and incomplete. Pirates were hunted, executed, or forced into exile. Yet the conditions that had produced them, economic precarity, labor surplus, and the legacy of sanctioned maritime violence, persisted. The confrontation achieved suppression in the short term, but the deeper vulnerabilities of empire, labor, and commerce remained unresolved. The narrative of order restored through spectacle would endure, obscuring the complex realities that had made piracy both possible and, for a time, profitable. The next stage would explore the final collapse of pirate havens, the systemic eradication of organized crews, and the enduring lessons about the relationship between state authority, labor, and the sea, lessons that continued to shape maritime life long after the last pirate was hanged. The collapse of pirate havens was neither sudden nor absolute, but it was relentless. Nassau, long the emblem of informal toleration, became a theater for the demonstration of imperial power. naval expeditions arrived with sufficient force to challenge entrenched crews, to blockade harbors, and to enforce new legal regimes with clarity and severity. Governors acted under direct instruction from metropolitan authorities, empowered with funds, ships, and men to dismantle the systems that had nurtured piracy for decades. The siege of these spaces was as much symbolic as practical. The empire sought to render visible its monopoly on maritime violence, reclaiming the authority that had once been diffuse, compromised, and selectively enforced. For the men within these enclaves, the experience was one of escalating danger. Pirate captains, skilled in evasion and subterfuge, confronted fleets capable of coordinated pursuit. Crews were forced to weigh escape against confrontation, to navigate waters made perilous not only by geography but by the strategic deployment of superior force. Every choice carried consequences: capture, death, or the precarious gamble of survival in exile. Life in a pirate haven became a daily negotiation between opportunity and annihilation. The human toll was immediate. Families in port towns who had relied on pirate commerce for income saw livelihoods collapse as trade was redirected through official channels. Sailors who had lived under conditional autonomy were conscripted into naval service, fled to distant ports, or accepted the uncertainty of exile. Children, laborers, and merchants who had once benefited indirectly from piracy now faced scarcity, while the spectacle of execution and suppression reinforced the narrative of moral and legal authority. Violence was no longer distributed through tolerated ambiguity, but concentrated in the assertion of state power. Naval operations relied on intelligence networks developed over years of engagement with pirate activity. Former sailors, informants, and colonial officials supplied information on ship movements, harbor defenses, and alliances. Success depended on knowledge as much as force. The skill and organization that had allowed pirate crews to thrive now exposed them to the very systems they had once exploited. Captured pirates were often tried swiftly, their trials publicized to reinforce the perception of restored order, while fleets continued to patrol trade routes to prevent resurgence. Yet eradication was never absolute. Pirate culture persisted in memory, in the skills of former sailors, and in remote regions beyond immediate control. Crews dispersed, some integrating into merchant shipping, others joining privateering ventures under new commissions. The state's monopoly of maritime authority was reinforced, but its prior reliance on informal tolerance left a legacy. Generations of sailors had learned that survival required flexibility, negotiation, and readiness to exploit ambiguity. The system of conditional autonomy that had produced pirates remained legible in the strategies and behavior of those who continued to navigate the seas. The psychological dimension of this suppression cannot be overstated. The execution of prominent captains, the destruction of fortified havens, and the relentless patrolling of major routes created an environment in which fear structured decision-making at every level. Sailors calibrated every movement, every harbor visit, and every engagement with both opportunity and risk in mind. Knowledge of what had happened to predecessors informed choices as powerfully as immediate orders or instructions. Authority was reinforced not only through law, but through the lived experience of its consequences. Economic consequences mirrored these human effects. Markets that had once relied on informal redistribution experienced contraction. Prices adjusted as scarcity returned in some commodities and surpluses appeared in others. Merchants, previously accustomed to the benefits of pirate redistribution, adapted by seeking protection from convoys and insurance mechanisms enforced by naval authority. Colonial administrations gained more predictable revenue streams, but at the cost of resilience that had been cultivated through decentralized, if illicit, maritime activity. At the level of imperial perception, The eradication of pirate havens validated assumptions about sovereignty, morality, and control. Proclamations emphasized the triumph of law over lawlessness, the restoration of order, and the consequences of criminality. Visual culture, prints, pamphlets, and public executions reinforced these narratives. Pirates became figures of cautionary legend, their lives reduced to stories of excess, cruelty, and folly. The nuance of systemic causality, of state complicity in creating the conditions that enabled piracy, was largely effaced. For the men who had lived under the dual regimes of state and pirate authority, these events represented a profound shift. Skills that had once offered advantage now risked exposure. Knowledge of maritime routes, tactics, and networks, previously a source of security, could lead to capture. Communities that had once benefited from pirate commerce faced sudden recalibration, adjusting to legal trade and the constraints of official oversight. Survival required adaptation to a new, more rigid system, one that had absorbed lessons from the failures of tolerance and applied them with brutal efficiency. The suppression campaigns ultimately demonstrated that empire could extend authority across vast maritime spaces, but only through sustained investment in force, administration, and intelligence. Pirates, who had flourished in conditions of selective enforcement, scarcity, and ambiguous legitimacy, were forced into extinction or exile. The narrative presented to metropolitan audiences framed this as moral and legal victory, but the underlying lesson for maritime labor was more complex. Obedience to law offered security only when backed by power, while autonomy and risk carried both reward and imminent peril. This phase marked a decisive, if incomplete, reordering of the Atlantic world. The systems that had produced piracy, war, surplus labor, economic precarity, and prior state-sanctioned violence were not erased, but the avenues through which they expressed themselves were systematically closed. The sea itself remained the same, vast, unpredictable, and indifferent. What changed was the framework of authority, the organization of labor, and the visibility of consequences. The collapse of pirate havens was not merely a military or legal event. It was a transformation in the lived experience of every sailor, merchant, and colonial inhabitant who depended on the rhythms of maritime commerce. The following stage would examine the long-term consequences of this eradication, the ways in which pirate memory persisted, the adaptations of labor and trade, and the enduring lessons about the interplay between state power opportunity and survival on the open sea. The eradication of pirate havens did not conclude the story of piracy, for its legacy persisted in subtler, more pervasive ways. Though fleets patrolled previously lawless waters and executions demonstrated the consequences of defiance, the knowledge, experience, and networks forged during decades of tolerated piracy remained alive. Sailors carried it with them into lawful service, merchants navigated it in the pricing and movement of goods, and colonial officials negotiated it in the gray spaces between enforcement and expedience. The suppression of overt piracy transformed the landscape of the sea, but it did not erase the human and structural memory of the conditions that had produced it. Former pirate crews dispersed into multiple roles, each shaped by their experience of survival, organization, and negotiation at sea. Some entered merchant service, bringing with them intimate knowledge of trade routes, navigational hazards, and the weaknesses of naval patrols. Their expertise enhanced the efficiency of commerce, yet also carried the potential for subversion, as familiarity with illicit strategies remained embedded in practice. Others accepted commissions as privateers in new conflicts, effectively channeling the skills honed in piracy back into state-sanctioned operations. In both cases, the line between legality and criminality remained permeable, defined by circumstance rather than principle. The memory of piracy also endured culturally. Tales circulated in taverns, ports, and coastal towns, preserving the exploits of crews who had once exploited the gaps in imperial authority. These stories, while often sensationalized, contained kernels of practical knowledge: which routes were safest, which ports tolerated illicit trade, and how to read the signals of opportunity and danger at sea. The narratives of daring raids and narrow escapes were more than entertainment. They were a form of collective memory, a repository of experience that informed the behavior of future generations of sailors. Colonial administrations faced the ongoing challenge of balancing suppression with practical necessity. Trade routes remained long and hazardous, labor conditions harsh, and resources limited. Sailors continued to be drawn into risky maritime employment by necessity rather than choice. Governors, aware of the consequences of strict enforcement, occasionally allowed informal tolerances to persist, whether through overlooked smuggling, delayed prosecution, or tacit approval of minor infractions. The lessons of piracy endured in these decisions. Control could be asserted, but flexibility was often required to maintain economic and social stability. The suppression campaigns also reshaped legal and administrative frameworks. Courts became more structured, maritime law more codified, and naval operations more coordinated. The experience of eradicating pirate havens informed future strategies for maintaining authority at sea, from convoy systems to intelligence networks and rapid response squadrons. These innovations reflected an understanding that maritime authority required both force and knowledge, and that failure to address structural conditions could create new crises. For the sailors who had navigated the age of piracy firsthand, the psychological imprint remained. The experience of conditional authority, survival under constant threat, and negotiation with both law and lawlessness influenced how they approached subsequent service. Discipline, reward, and risk were measured not only against immediate circumstance, but against the memory of what had been possible when authority was ambiguous. These lessons persisted in the maritime culture of the 18th century, shaping expectations, behavior, and attitudes toward state power. Economically, the legacy of piracy endured in the resilience of trade networks. Routes that had been shaped by informal redistribution persisted, sometimes adapted to legal frameworks, sometimes exploited in subtle ways. The circulation of goods continued to rely on speed, discretion, and local knowledge, skills honed during the era of tolerated piracy. Merchants, aware of the historical dependence on these practices, incorporated them into planning and risk management, even as they publicly celebrated the triumph of law and order. The suppression of piracy also clarified the limits of imperial authority. States could eliminate organized crews and dismantle havens, but they could not fully control the human behaviors that had produced them. Economic pressure, surplus labor, and the inherent hazards of maritime life continued to shape decisions and create opportunities for innovation, risk-taking, and sometimes illegality. The eradication of visible piracy was a partial solution. The structural causes remained, embedded in the system of empire and the lived experience of sailors. In this way, the period following the collapse of pirate havens became a moment of transition rather than closure. The overt threat of piracy was removed, but the lessons it imparted, the knowledge it transmitted, and the adaptations it necessitated persisted across generations. Sailors, merchants, and officials continued to negotiate the boundaries of authority, legality, and survival, informed by the practices developed during the age of tolerated piracy. This enduring legacy set the stage for the final phase of the story, the consolidation of imperial control over the seas, the formalization of maritime law, and the transformation of the laboring sailor's experience into one shaped increasingly by the state's monopoly on violence and the codification of authority, rather than by negotiation, improvisation, or conditional autonomy. The lessons of piracy, though suppressed, remained written into the very currents of maritime life. The final phase of this long arc unfolded not in dramatic battle or public execution, but in the slow, deliberate consolidation of imperial authority across the oceans. The seas that had once been shaped by negotiation, improvisation, and the informal tolerances of colonial administrators now fell under the systematic surveillance and regulation of state power. Naval patrols became routine, convoys escorted valuable cargo, and maritime law, previously uneven and inconsistently enforced, was codified with clarity designed to preclude ambiguity. The world that had allowed piracy to flourish was methodically transformed, leaving little space for the improvisation and conditional autonomy that had sustained it. Even as fleets maintained control over trade routes, the human dimension remained at the center. Sailors endured strict discipline, long deployments, and the constant threat of injury or death, yet they also carried the knowledge of what had once been possible, the strategies, networks, and autonomy that had allowed pirate crews to survive and thrive. This memory informed behavior, fostering caution, opportunism, and, in some cases, quiet resistance within legal boundaries. Experience continued to shape maritime labor, even under the growing weight of imperial authority. Colonial ports, once incubators of pirate activity, were transformed through both enforcement and administration. Harbor defenses were strengthened, customs officers and magistrates were better equipped, and trade routes were monitored more rigorously. Local economies adjusted, previously tolerated redistributions of goods were curtailed, and merchants adapted to legal mechanisms such as insured convoys and regulated markets. Yet the social memory of piracy, the skills, the networks, and the stories remained embedded in port culture, quietly influencing interactions and expectations. The suppression of piracy also prompted innovation in legal and administrative structures. Admiralty courts became more efficient, offering consistent procedures for the adjudication of maritime disputes. Codes of conduct for sailors were formalized, emphasizing obedience, accountability, and alignment with imperial interests. Naval training integrated lessons learned from encounters with pirate crews. Intelligence gathering, rapid response, and strategic coordination became standard practice. The state's monopoly on maritime violence was reinforced not solely through force, but through the creation of predictable systems designed to reduce the space in which piracy might reemerge. Yet the human and economic pressures that had once driven men to piracy did not vanish. Surplus labor, hazardous conditions, and economic precarity persisted across the maritime world. Sailors continued to navigate these pressures, sometimes exploiting loopholes, sometimes negotiating tolerances, and sometimes risking marginal forms of illegality. While overt pirate activity declined, the experience of conditional autonomy remained a subtle but enduring feature of maritime life, a reminder that suppression could control action but not entirely reshape motivation or opportunity. Culturally, the age of piracy became codified into memory as a period of excess, danger, and moral clarity imposed through execution and spectacle. Stories circulated of daring raids, cunning captains, and the dramatic fall of pirate havens. These narratives emphasized morality, law, and state triumph, often obscuring the structural causes that had produced piracy in the first place: war, surplus labor, state-sanctioned privateering, and economic precarity. Yet for those who had lived through it, the reality was far more nuanced. Piracy was both a product of systemic failure and a form of adaptation within a harsh and unpredictable world. The long-term consequence of this consolidation was the reshaping of maritime labor and identity. Sailors learned to navigate authority with an acute awareness of risk and opportunity. The comparison between pirate crews and naval service informed expectations about discipline, reward, and survival. While legal authority now dominated, the practical knowledge developed during the age of piracy, of navigation, negotiation, and contingency remained a crucial element of life at sea. Economically, the state's consolidation stabilized trade, reduced the unpredictability of maritime commerce, and created systems of insurance, convoy protection, and legal adjudication that underpinned imperial revenue. Yet this order came at the cost of flexibility and autonomy. The improvisational strategies that had allowed ports, crews, and merchants to survive under conditions of neglect were curtailed, replaced by centralized oversight. In effect, empire had won control over the seas, but at the expense of the informal systems that had previously balanced risk, reward, and survival. By the close of this period, piracy, as a systemic, tolerated phenomenon, had been effectively eradicated. Its crews were dispersed, its havens dismantled, and its operations suppressed by force, law, and administration. Yet the legacy endured, in the skills of sailors, in the memory of ports, in the stories circulated along trade routes, and in the awareness that survival at sea required not only compliance, but judgment, adaptability, and knowledge of human behavior as much as maritime skill. The history of piracy, once a tolerated and necessary part of imperial maritime systems, thus concluded not with a single battle or act of justice, but through the relentless, comprehensive application of authority. Its lessons remained, embedded in the practice of sailors, the design of trade networks, and the administration of empire. The seas were never the same. They were now governed by law, monitored by power, and marked by the memory of those who had once exploited their spaces to survive, thrive, and challenge the limits of authority. This final transformation illustrates the enduring truth of maritime history, that authority, opportunity, and human endurance are inseparable, and that even as systems of control assert themselves, the echoes of conditional autonomy, improvisation, and survival continue to shape the lived experience of those who work upon the oceans.